too short to be drinking shitty beer.
We never gave up anything, you know. We never let them do anything to us. We never said, okay, yes, sir, you know. We never did that. We always said, fuck you, you know, and we're still saying it today, which is why we're so broke, you know.
Welcome to another edition of Bands, Bikes and Booze Reviews. This is a video that was sort of requested by a few viewers, and it's my Motörhead top 5 albums and top 5 singles. Now, this was quite hard for me to compile because Motörhead are one of my favourite bands. I'd go as far as to say they're my second favourite band behind Black Sabbath when it comes to metal. And the choices that I've made are probably not going to be the same choices that you would make if you're a Motörhead fan. However, it's all personal taste, it's all subjective. At the end of the day, if you're a Motörhead fan, you're already winning in life, in my opinion. So, without further ado, let's run them down. Right, I've decided to do them in the correct order this time, and I'm going to go from number 5 down to number 1. So, at number 5, Another Perfect Day. Now, this might come as a little bit of a surprise to a few people. It isn't really considered one of Motörhead's classic albums. It was an album that came about after the departure of Fast Eddie. His last records that was recorded by him, or with him on it, I should say, playing guitar, was Iron Fist. And after that, he promptly stormed off. Well, he didn't steam off, but he decided to leave Motörhead. I think what prompted Fast Eddie to leave Motörhead was, in his own words, the duet that they did. I think it was with Lemmy did with Wendy O. Williams when they did Stand By Your Man. And obviously other things had been going on, but that was the final straw. That was the straw that broke the camel's back, and he done the off. So what did they do? Well, they done, in my opinion, what was quite a good move. They got Brian Robertson from Thin Lizzy into the band to play guitar. Now, he only played on one album, and of course this album was Another Perfect Day, but there are some absolute killer songs on that album. And for me, some of the standout tracks are I've Got Mine, Another Perfect Day. There's not a bad track. I also like Dancing on Your Grave. It's one of my favourite Motörhead songs of all time. I think it's just a brilliant track. I remember when I first heard it, it was on the No Remorse album, and it was probably the most melodic Motörhead had ever been in their career. And it's a great track, and I really like it. But perhaps the most well-known song on that album is Shine. So for me, they're the 3 real standout tracks. Now, to have an album that's only got 3 songs in it that you're saying is a classic album, yeah, I get that. But in my opinion, they are 3 fantastic Motörhead songs. And Brian Robertson's guitar work doesn't really need much introduction. If you're a fan of Thin Lizzy, you obviously know what he can do, and he sort of brought that over into Motörhead. Now, there's a lot of people that would say that Fast Eddie couldn't really play, and it relied a lot on the same riffs, and he relied a lot on a wah pedal as well. And there may be some truth to that, but Brian Robertson was, in my opinion, was the better guitar player, certainly when it came to lead work. Some of the lead work on that album is just brilliant, in my opinion. So that's why that's going to be number 5. Number 4, Overkill. Now, this is an album that the title track, in my opinion, started off the whole thrash scene. Now, if you've never heard Overkill, the song, I suggest you listen to it. It's an absolute killer track. When I first heard it, I remember when I was a kid, I was only about, I think it must have been about, I would have been about 12 or 13, and I heard that. I thought it was a drum machine. I'd never heard double bass drums played in that fashion before. And of course, Fast Eddie playing the riff over the top of that was just brilliant. And of course, Phil Taylor owned that and made it his own. It's probably one of the most recognisable drum intros on any song, certainly on the metal genre. I don't know about other genres, maybe, I don't know, I'm thinking the one that immediately springs to mind is Africa by Toto. But there's not many other songs with a drum intro like that that is so recognisable. But that's not the only great song on that album. Songs like Stay Clean, Damage Case and No Class are some of my favourite Motörhead songs as well. I mean, they're all good, let's face it, but they are real classics in my opinion. Now, you've got to remember that album came out just at the cusp of the new wave of British heavy metal. It came out in 1979, and it fitted in really well, in my opinion. It was loud, it was heavy, there was fast, high energy songs on there, and I think this was where Motörhead was really starting to make their mark. And I would argue that this is where Motörhead really did take off, really did find their niche, and really did find their sound with that album. So for that reason, that album, Overkill, is number 4. Number 3 is an absolutely superb Motörhead album, and I really did have trouble putting this in order because it's one of my favourite albums, and for me, I don't think there's a bad track on there. And that one is, of course, the 1993 offering, Bastards. I think that is an absolutely superb album. Now, you have to remember, they brought out an album just before that called March or Die, and that got a sort of a lukewarm reception, and a lot of people thought Motörhead was sort of losing their way, and then they came back with this one. This is an absolute killer album, and it's got some killer tracks on it. Death or Glory, Burner, Liar is probably one of my favourite Motörhead songs of all time. I absolutely love that track. But the standout for me was a kind of a ballad that they did, which Motörhead really aren't renowned for their ballads, but they did that, Don't Let Daddy Kiss Me Goodnight. And I remember listening to that and thinking, wow, this is different. But if you listen to the lyrics, they're quite dark. It's about child abuse and stuff like that, which I don't think many metal bands had, up until that point, really sort of broached the subject. But it's a good song in its own right, regardless of who sings it. Now, you may argue that Lemmy's voice really isn't the perfect ballad voice, and you may have some traction in that argument, but you can't deny that that still is a good track. For me, though, the standout track is Liar. I don't know what it is with that song, but I just love it. It's got everything for me. It's got a really catchy chorus, got a great riff, and I think Phil Campbell's work on that song, but also on that album as well, were probably some of his finest. Now, some people may have a different opinion on that, but for me, I think that's probably one of his best, if not the best. So yeah, 1993's Bastards album, for me, is number 3. Now, number 2. This is an absolutely brilliant album, but you may say that I'm sort of copping out here, because many have argued, including Lemmy himself, that this was basically a Motörhead's greatest hits, with a couple of, or 4 to be exact, 4 new songs latched onto the end of it. I would say it would go a little bit further than that. Now, there's an interesting story behind this. This album came out in 1984, and it came out on the Bronze record label, as did most of their stuff with the classic lineup. I think the Another Perfect Day album came out on Bronze as well, but that came out in 1983, and Brian Robertson had left the band by then. So it was sort of looking, certainly to a lot of people, that Bronze were losing faith in Motörhead. They've sort of had the idea, and I would sort of go with that as well. You've got to remember, these are different times now. Record companies were very fickle. If you weren't making money for them, they would just toss you by the wayside like a used sock. But that album came out, and it was basically a compilation of Motörhead's greatest hits. However, just before that, Lemmy had auditioned 2 guitarists, and them 2 guitarists were Phil Campbell and Wurzel, and they were to stay with Motörhead for quite some time. Of course, Wurzel left, and they became a 3-piece again back in the 90s. But on this album, there are 4 of the new songs that Motörhead had done with these 2 new guitarists. They also had a new drummer as well. Phil Taylor had left the band in 1983 as well. Now, he left more or less at the same time as Brian Robertson. Reason being, he was a massive fan of Thin Lizzy, huge fan, and he really liked working with Brian Robertson, and he sort of questioned his musical direction and where he was going with Motörhead. So he decided to do the off along with Brian Robertson. So at some point, and Lemmy does quote this quite a lot, he was the only member of the band at one point, and it was that point. However, I think, reading between the lines, Phil Taylor did stay to audition the guitarists, and then he done the off. But the old drummer from Saxon, Pete Gill, was suggested by Phil Campbell, and he joined the band, and that was the new lineup from 1984. And there was 4 songs on that album that they insisted, well, Lemmy insisted, were on that album, just to prove that it wasn't a greatest hits album, reason number 1. And number 2, So as he would get the new guitarists out there and people could hear what the new lineup sounded like. And I remember buying this when it came out, more or less in 1984. It was in a leather-bound cover, double album, it had obviously 2 bits of vinyl. And on the end of each side of the vinyl, you had a new track by Motörhead. Now, these 4 new tracks were Steal Your Face, which I think is a fantastic song, Killed by Death, an absolute classic from Motörhead in my opinion. You had Locomotive, which up until that point, I would say was the fastest and heaviest song that Motörhead had ever done. The drum intro on that does give Overkill a run for its money, in my opinion. But there's that as well. And also one that I like, because I've got bad teeth, and that's Snaggletooth. And Lemmy did dedicate that to his teeth, but to be honest, if you live in the UK and you've got bad teeth, that could be for anybody over there. So yeah, a bit of an anthem for denture wearers, in my opinion. But that album was great. It had the best of the classic lineup, or what is known as the classic lineup from the early years. You had the best of the Overkill album, best of the Bomber album on there. You also had the best of Another Perfect Day, the 3 best songs off there, in fact. And they were my introduction to that album, and that's how I got into the album. In fact, it's how I got into quite a lot of Motörhead albums. So it did serve a purpose, and it also renewed my faith in Motörhead. When I heard the 4 new tracks, I thought, wow, Motörhead have still got it. And especially Locomotive. You got to remember, I was coming off the punks. Well, I wasn't coming off the punks. So, you know, I loved punk music. I loved fast, thrashy music. Discharge were one of my favourite bands. GBH, I loved them as well. And to hear a track like Locomotive, I absolutely loved it. So that for me is number 2. Number 1, No Sleep Till Hammersmith. What a fucking album this is. For me, this is the epitome of Motörhead. I believe, and I've seen them numerous occasions, well, I say numerous, I've lost count of the amount of times I saw Motörhead, and I have to say, I always did prefer them live. The energy, the sheer rawness, and the loudness, the brutal loudness that came from Motörhead, whether they be a 3-piece or a 4-piece, was just insane. And for me, the album that captures that best, in my opinion, now they have done a few live albums, but this one for me is an absolute killer. And I remember when the track Motörhead Live came out in 1981, and that was a single that was on Bronze, and it actually made the charts. It got to number 6. And I remember being around a mate's house, and I heard that on the radio. His mum used to have a radio in the kitchen, and they always listen. If you're of a certain age and you lived in the UK, you'd know that there used to be a chart rundown on a Sunday. Now at that age, I would have been 10 years old. I wasn't into punk music. I wasn't into any music at all, really. But I do remember that song playing over the radio, and I remember just standing there as a kid, just listening to it, thinking, what the hell is this? This noise that's coming out the radio. And of course it was Motörhead Live. And that really put the seed of Motörhead in my mind. And of course when I got into punk music, all the punks, all the skinheads that I knew, all the metalers, all the metalheads that I knew, the headbangers as they was known back then, everyone was into Motörhead. They loved them. And that's what I love about Motörhead. They are just one of these bands that they appeal to everybody, even non-metal fans as well. How many times, even now, people, they've heard 3 or 4 heavy metal songs, even if they're not into heavy metal. I would say Enter Sandman is definitely one of them, but the Ace of Spades is also another one. I mean, it's been on so many TV adverts. You hear it in most pubs. A lot of bands cover it now. A lot of cover bands in pubs play it now as well. In fact, I've done it a few times with a local band that I dep for every now and again. But that's on the album as well. It's a great track. But for me, the whole album in general, it's just got so many good tracks on there, but played live. And if you look at the history of that album, or the circumstances around the album, I should say, it was on a tour, a very short, small tour of the United Kingdom. They didn't even play at Hammersmith. Now, the reason the album is called No Sleep Till Hammersmith is because Hammersmith was usually the last date that they would play. However, on this tour, they didn't. They mostly played gigs in Newcastle. I think there was some in Birmingham. There was one in Leeds, and I think there was one in Belfast as well. And they called it a short, sharp pain in the neck tour. I think they'd done it with Girls' School as well. But they called it the short, sharp pain in the neck was because around that time, Phil Taylor played with a broken neck, and he didn't even know it. They were fooling around at one point in a hotel and there was, I don't know, some shenanigans going on, horseplay basically, and he ended up with a broken neck, and he woke up with a broken neck. He went to bed drunk, no doubt, but he woke up with a really sore neck, and he was twisting his neck this way and that, and the doctor said he could have so easily have been paralysed from the waist down. So that's where the tour got its name from. If you listen, it sounds very uniform, as in the production. And the reason for that is some of the dates that they did, I mean, had it in mind to do a live album anyway, but they were going to take songs from more or less all of the dates, but it turned out the only ones that really came out well were the Newcastle dates. So that's probably why if you listen to that album, it sounds very uniform in the production, which again is a good thing in my opinion. And according to Lemmy, he didn't do any overdubs afterwards, apart from a couple of choruses. Now, if you've ever listened to a live album, you can more or less guarantee, it's rare, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's rare that bands don't do overdubs. I know Judas Priest used to do a lot of solos on their live albums, certainly that Unleashed in the East, I don't know if you've heard that. There was a nickname for that, they used to call it Unleashed in the Studio, because most of it was done in the studio, but that's by the by. But for me, this album, it encapsulated the rawness, the heaviness, the loudness, the pure energy of Motörhead at that time. And for that reason alone, and I still listen to that album to this day, that album for me is number one. Now, as a little bit of a bonus, you might not be interested in this, but you're fucking getting it anyway. These are my top 5 Motörhead songs. So I'll do it in ascending order. I know I've done the Sabbath rundown from number 1 to number 5, which is a bit of an anticlimax really, but I'm going to do it the right way this time, and I'll do it from number 5 to number 1. Number 5 is a song from the album I was just talking about, No Sleep Till Hammersmith. And for me, this is the best version of that song. And that song, for me, being a biker, it really does sum up what it's like being on the road on a bike. And that song is Iron Horse. Now, if you've ever listened to the On Parole album, which came out in 1979, but was originally recorded in 1975, and was the first song that Filthy Taylor, Filthy Animal, whatever you want to call him, it was the first song that he played on. Now, the original drummer, Lucas Fox, I think had left at the time, or he hadn't showed up. I think the original guitarist, he knew Phil Taylor, and he got him to drum on that track, and he done a really good job on it. However, I much prefer the live version. It's got a better tempo in my opinion, it's got a better feel, and just, I don't know, it's just got a bit more energy to it in my opinion. And that really does reinforce what I was saying about the No Sleep Till Hammersmith album. The tempo on that, the energy on that, really does outstrip a lot of the stuff that they did in the studio. And that's why that album is number 1. And for me, Iron Horse, Born to Lose, the live version from No Sleep Till Hammersmith, is my number 5. The song that got me into Motörhead. Now, this album came out in 1982, and by that time I was well into me punk music. I loved me oi music as well. In fact, I probably liked oi more than punk at that stage. And I remember a fella used to live around the corner from us, and he used to have a brother who would buy records every week, and his brother was into punk, but his brother liked a bit of metal, but his brother really liked Motörhead as well. And I remember he stole it off his brother, and he came round to our house. And my mate Richard used to live on the Broadwater Farm Estate. He's the one that got me into punk. And I remember all three of us, I had a record player in my room, and I remember all three of us sitting on the bed, putting that single on, and being absolutely blown away by Iron Fist. Now, it had just come out, and I don't know whether you remember the cover, but it had all three of them dressed up as Vikings. And yeah, it was a bit corny, to be honest, but that was what metal was like at the time. But the music on there, it really did have all the energy of punk, which I was really into. It had the energy of oi as well, which I was really into at the time. And it was quite up-tempo too. And I loved that. And I must have played that single about 30 times. On the B-side was Remember Me, I'm Gone, which is not a bad track. I don't mind that. That's on the Iron Fist album as well. But for me, the song Iron Fist just blew me away. I much prefer it to the Ace of Spades. In fact, I think I'm a little bit sick of the Ace of Spades, if truth be told. I've heard it so many times, it's become a bit of a cliche in my opinion. But the opening bass riff on there is quite similar to the Ace of Spades. It's that distorted bass, and at the time I didn't work out that was actually a bass. I thought it was guitar that was starting the intro, and yeah, that really did intrigue me listening to that. And it was only years later that I realised that was actually Lemmy's bass sound. But another thing that stands out for me on this song is the opening 2 words, Sieg Heil. How the fuck they got away with that, I do not know, but they did, and they didn't give a fuck about it, which is another reason I like Motörhead. It's their attitude. They just do not fucking care. And I think that a lot of that comes from Lemmy, and I think it's the reason why Motörhead appeal to a lot of people. But for me, that was my introduction to Motörhead, and it was all downhill from then on. Now, number 3 is a song from the album that I mentioned in the previous section, and it was off the Bastards album, which came out in 1993, and the song is Liar. Now, I don't know why I really like this song, but for some reason, it just really appeals to me. I don't know whether it's the chord progression on the pre-chorus. I don't know whether it's Phil Campbell's playing on this song, and in fact on the whole album, to be honest. But it just works for me. I love Lemmy's vocals on this. I think the words are great. I mean, who doesn't know a liar in their life? And yeah, I've played this so many times, and it's on my when I'm out and about, or I'm on a long train journey, and I've got a playlist going along. This is guaranteed to be on that playlist. Now, as I said, I love that album. That is a fantastic album, but for me, this is the standout song amongst some great songs that are on that album. So yeah, for me, number 3 is definitely Liar from the Bastards album. Number 2, what a track, what a subject to sing about. Probably not politically correct now, but who cares? Bomber. This is the title track off the Bomber album. And I have to say, again, I'm going to go back to No Sleep Till Hammersmith. I do like the version that's on the Bomber album. It's a great track. But when you listen to it on No Sleep Till Hammersmith, it just really stands out as being loud, heavy, some great guitar work on there from Fast Eddie Clarke, some great drumming as well. I mean, they all played well on that, so I shouldn't really single out anyone because it's just a brilliant performance. As I say, I like the song from the album, but for me, the standout version is on No Sleep Till Hammersmith. It really is louder, it's heavier, it's more rough around the edges, and it just works in my opinion. But it's a great song, and Lemmy actually said that he wrote that after reading a book by the same name by Len Deighton. I'm not sure whether you've heard of Len Deighton, but he used to write wartime fiction, and I do remember his books from the 70s. They used to be kicking around the house for some reason. I don't know why. My mum was an avid reader, so there'd always be books kicking around the house. But that book was there, and I remember reading it, and it's quite a good book. It's you know, I don't know how widely available it is now, but I can see how he would have got all the lines in the song where he got them from. It's all in there basically. You know, the line "No night fighter is going to stop me getting through." There's stuff in there about night fighters. I don't know where the napalm comes from. They would have had incendiary devices, the RAF, but back then. But yeah, you wouldn't really have had napalm. That was an American invention. Anyway, I digress. I'm a fucker for doing that, and I do apologise. But for me, number 2, Bomber. Number 1, and this is probably going to be controversial. Probably not many people have heard this track, and if you have, as I say, you're winning in life. This for me was one of Motörhead's finest moments, and it's from the Another Perfect Day album with Brian Robertson on guitar. I'll get onto him in a second. The track is Dancing on Your Grave. Now, I remember when I first heard this, it wasn't actually on the Another Perfect Day album. It was on No Remorse. But it was a real standout track for me. It was more melodic, it was slightly slower paced, it was still heavy, don't get me wrong, and it did have Lemmy's signature vocals on there. It sounded like he'd swallowed a mixture of sand, gravel, ashtray, concrete and ballast. And it kicks fucking arse, to coin an American phrase. But what really stands out for me is the melodic guitar playing on there. It's got a fantastic riff on there, and the solo work on there is really good as well. Now, it's a shame that Brian Robertson only lasted for one album, but he was, to put it kindly, a colourful character. Literally. He used to turn up in some strange attire. He was not averse to wearing leg warmers and a headband. Now, Mark Knopfler might have got away with that, back in the 80s, but if you turned up at a heavy metal gig wearing that, you would probably get, I don't know, either a kick in, thrown out, or probably both, which is what happened to Brian Robertson. And apparently he refused to play any of the old stuff, and he would only play the new stuff, of course, which pissed off a lot of people who'd paid good money to see Motörhead. Now, I don't really get that, refusing to play the old stuff. Maybe he thought it was beneath him because it was simple, but that's what people went to see Motörhead for at that time. They didn't really, I mean, how many times have you been to a gig and you know, the band that's playing have got a new album out, but you just go there to hear the classics. And that was a big sort of, I don't know, a bugbear, I suppose, with Lemmy, and it came to a head from what I've read about the whole saga with Brian Robertson. It came to a head when they were doing a gig in Germany, and he turned up in a pink tutu, and he got chased out of there, and I think beaten up as well by a group of Hell's Angels, which, I'm not condoning violence, but for fuck's sake, if you turn up in a pink tutu, I mean, this was the 80s as well, you just couldn't get away with that being a bloke. You really couldn't. I don't care how nice your arsehole was, you weren't going to get away with it in front of a load of Hell's Angels, and especially German Hell's Angels. And he was dealt with, and the rest, as they say, is history. So that sums up my Motörhead top 5 songs and top 5 albums. I'd love to hear what your Motörhead top songs are. Put them in the comments. I'd love to know what your favourite albums are, and if you've got any stories about Motörhead, I'd love to hear them. Now, as you may know, I'm starting to do a little bit more in the studio. I'm going to be reviewing some of these guitars, I'm going to be reviewing amps, and I'm going to be recording stuff on the old computer as well. So watch this space. I don't know whether the lighting is too clever in here, but I need to work on that as well. Bear in mind, this is the first video I've done of a night time in this studio, so the lighting may be all over the place, but I will work on it and the quality will get better. I don't know whether I'm going to be doing beer reviews in here, because knowing my luck, I would probably spill beer all over the place and it would be an absolute effing shambles. But there you go. If you want any more top 5 rundowns, top 5 songs or anything like that, please leave them in the comments. I'm not doing Iron Maiden. I'm not a big, well, am I doing Iron Maiden? Yeah, go on. I'm sort of thinking about most metal bands, so just leave it down there. You know, the old stuff. Priest, Saxon, yeah, even Iron Maiden. I'm not a massive fan of them, to be honest, even though they are West Ham fans. Well, Steve Harris is anyway. But that sort of stuff. The modern stuff, yeah, I'm into a few bands, but try me. Put them in the comments, let me know. And if you want to subscribe, subscribe. If you don't, don't. You're under no obligation. And remember, life is too short to be listening to shitty music. Like and subscribe. What a puppy gets it. Isn't that right, Purse? Yeah, get off.